Bright Minds, the podcast from the John Adams Institute, is brought to you by the members of the John Adams. Why not become a member yourself, or even better, a patron, and enjoy all the extras and benefits? Find out more at john-adams.nl, john-adams.nl, and click on Become a Member. From Amsterdam, this is Bright Minds, the podcast of the John Adams Institute, a treasure trove of the best and the brightest of American thinking. And this is the author and historian Daniel Ziblatt detailing how to recognize a demagogue.
Does a politician condone or accept violence? Does a politician attack civil liberties, such as the media? Does a politician accept the legitimacy of their political rivals, or do they call their rivals agents of foreign powers? And then the fourth criteria, do politicians accept the basic rules of a democratic constitutional order? And what was so striking was that Donald Trump checked all of these boxes.
He checked all the boxes in the sense that Donald Trump respected none of these things. And this led Harvard professor, historian, and writer Daniel Ziblatt to wonder out loud, how do democracies die? So he co-authored a book asking that very question with fellow Harvard political scientist and professor of government, Steven Levitsky. And they concluded that these days, when democracies die, it's not at the hands of generals, but of duly elected leaders, presidents or prime ministers who subvert the very process that brought them to power. And indeed, Mr. Ziblatt gave this talk to our Amsterdam audience in January of 2020 on the cusp of President Trump's first impeachment. But as an historian, he also looks at America's current political crisis and concludes we've kind of been here before and survived it. So first, I'm going to play his talk to the audience in which he lays out this message that is both a warning and somewhat hopeful. And then he's interviewed by the Dutch journalist Chris Keine for a far-ranging conversation about the history of the American demagogue and why American democracy is worth saving. So here's Daniel Ziblatt.
I am going to talk to you tonight about the dangers facing American democracy today. I'm going to step back from the headlines, as difficult as that is, but I think it's actually important to do that because I think it's really important to try to think about how we ended up where we are. It's often very tempting, and I find myself falling into this trap of being caught by breaking news alerts and the latest headlines and losing sense of the bigger story. And so I want to give us a bit of a sense of the bigger story this evening, drawing on the book that I wrote with Steve Levitsky. The motivation really is that if we are going to understand, if we're going to figure out a way out of the situation in the United States, a way to help repair American democracy, it's really critical to understand the history of how we ended up in this situation. We have to get the history right to understand how to get out of the mess that we're in. So what I'm going to do this evening in my 25 minutes or so is to give you my account of how we ended up in this mess. And I hope in the discussion we can talk about ways out. So I'll begin. I think it's important to put the U.S. in a global context. And any discussion of the American predicament must recognize that there is a global trend taking place. When you look around the world today, it's clear that democracies don't die like they used to. Democracies used to die in the form of military coups. During the Cold War, 3/4 of democratic breakdowns took the form of military coups at the hands of men with guns, generals. Since the end of the Cold War, most democracies die in much more subtle ways. They die not at the hands of generals, but rather of presidents, prime minister, elected politician who use the very institutions of democracy to subvert it. So elections, plebiscites, acts of Congress, Supreme Court rulings. This is Hugo Chavez, Vladimir Putin, Viktor Orban, Erdogan in Turkey. What's so dangerously insidious about this particular mode of democratic death is that it very often happens precisely behind a facade of democracy. So it's hard to see it when it's happening. There are no tanks in the streets. Constitutions remain intact. Congress or parliaments continue to meet. And so as a result of all of this, many citizens aren't aware that it's happening until it's too late. In 2011, so 12 years into Hugo Chavez's presidency, a survey was done in Venezuela, and a majority of Venezuelans said in the survey they still lived in a democracy. So understanding that democracies die in this way today is really important, because if the road to democratic death often happens today at the ballot box, one of the keys to prevent this from happening is to prevent autocratic-minded leaders from getting elected in the first place. So to prevent figures like Orban, Putin, Erdogan from using electoral institutions to get elected in the first place. I would argue that the United States failed this task in 2016. Now, there are many reasons, of course, why Donald Trump won the election, got elected in 2016. But in my book with Steve Levitsky, we focus on one factor that we think doesn't get enough attention. That is how our political parties pick their candidates for the presidency. This is important because historically, the US has actually had an incredible number of demagogues in its history. So in the 1920s, Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company, rabid anti-Semite, really had presidential ambitions. Huey Long, as we've just heard, in the 1930s, the autocratic governor of Louisiana. Joe McCarthy, George Wallace, the segregationist governor in the 1960s. Each of these figures was very popular. In fact, there's Gallup poll data actually going back to the 1930s, and at their peak points of popularity, each of them had around 30-35% approval ratings, which is not so far from Donald Trump's base when he was elected president. But none of these figures I just mentioned, despite being very popular, ever made it close to the presidency. These kinds of political figures, though, in American history were kept out not because they weren't popular, they were popular. They were kept out because of the way that political parties in the United States used to pick their candidates for the presidency. So prior to 1972, American presidential candidates were selected in the old convention system, in what we often now think of as a system of smoke-filled back rooms. This old convention system was not very democratic, was not inclusive, it was not transparent, but it was actually a quite effective filtration system. Party leaders who often worked very closely with potential candidates, knew their strengths, knew their weaknesses, knew how they dealt with stress and adversity, and crucially knew which might be potential demagogues. These were the ones who played a critical role. These party leaders were, in effect, party gatekeepers. They knew who might be potential demagogues. So despite all of its shortcomings, and there were many, I wouldn't argue that we should go back to a system of smoke-filled rooms. The old convention system had basically a perfect record in keeping demagogues far from power. Now, the primary system, which was adopted in the 1970s, 1972 in the United States, was far more open, far more transparent, far more democratic than the old convention system. But it also dramatically weakened the power of party leaders. And we clearly saw this in 2016. Republican Party leaders, almost to an individual, despised Donald Trump. They thought he was unfit for office, but they had no means in the primary process to stop him. So primaries, and this is perhaps the least popular part of our book, are a double-edged sword. They are more democratic, but they also leave us more vulnerable to demagogues. Had the old convention system been in place in 2016, Donald Trump wouldn't have gotten anywhere near the White House. Now, electing a demagogue, extremist demagogue, is never good for democracy. That's clear. But it doesn't condemn us to democratic breakdown, because this is actually where our political institutions are supposed to come into play. Americans place a lot of faith in their Constitution, and there's actually good reason for this. The US has oldest written constitution, in some sense the most successful constitution in the world. Our system of checks and balances has constrained many powerful and ambitious presidents. You can think of Andrew Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, and of course Nixon. But one of the core messages of our book is that the American Constitution, and for that matter, any constitution, is not enough to save us. The words on the page, while important, aren't enough. Constitutions actually work best when they are reinforced by unwritten rules, or what we call democratic norms. So our book focuses on two key democratic norms in particular. The first is the norm of what we call mutual toleration, or accepting the legitimacy of our partisan rivals. So this means no matter how much we disagree with, or in fact dislike our partisan rivals, we recognize publicly that they are loyal citizens who have an equal and legitimate right to compete for office, and if they beat us, to govern. In other words, we do not treat our rivals as enemies. The second norm is a little less familiar, perhaps. It's the norm that we call institutional forbearance. Now, what we mean by forbearance is essentially refraining from exercising one's legal right. It's an act of deliberate self-restraint, an underutilization of one's power. Now, we often don't think about this in politics, but it's absolutely vital. Think about just for a moment what a president in the United States under the Constitution legally is able to do. And we're reminded of this, of course, all the time these days. The president can pardon whoever he or she wants at any point for any reason. Any president with a congressional majority constitutionally can pack the Supreme Court. If you don't like how the Supreme Court is ruling, expand it to 11, expand it to 13, fill it with allies. This is all perfectly legal. Or if a president's agenda is stalled in Congress, the president can rule through executive order and declare national emergencies. Again, something we have seen recently. The Constitution doesn't prohibit such action. Think about what Congress can do. Congress can use, and the Senate can use its right of advising consent to block a president, any pick for the cabinet or a Supreme Court of a president. And of course, the House of Representatives can impeach a president on any grounds, and in effect, it chooses. So my point is that politicians can exploit the letter of the Constitution in ways that totally eviscerate the spirit of the Constitution. This is court packing, partisan impeachments, government shutdowns, national emergencies. This mode of politics is a kind of politics that the legal scholar Mark Tushnet calls constitutional hardball. Constitutional hardball. So let me just give you an example of constitutional hardball from a different setting. So Argentina is a country that in 1853 adopted a constitution that was modeled explicitly on the American Constitution. One scholar, in fact, actually has identified that 2/3 of the text of the Argentinian Constitution was lifted directly from the American Constitution. So it's a virtual replica of the US Constitution. But Juan Perón, when he was elected president in the 1940s, used that very Constitution to undermine Argentinian democracy. So one of the first moves that Perón made when elected president in 1946 was to have Congress impeach 3 out of 5 Supreme Court justices on grounds of malfeasance, a move that actually was technically legal. Congress then passed a law making it a crime to disrespect the president. So when the opposition leader, Ricardo Balbín, was arrested under this law, he challenged the constitutionality of the law in court. This newly packed Supreme Court upheld the law. All of this, again, was technically legal. So if you look at any failed or failing democracy around the world today or in the past, you'll find an abundance of constitutional hardball. Not only Argentina under Perón, but Spain and Germany in the 1930s, Venezuela under Chavez, contemporary Hungary, Poland, and Turkey. What prevents a constitutional system of checks and balances from descending into this kind of form of constitutional hardball that can wreck a democracy is forbearance. It's a shared commitment to exercising restraint in the exercise of one's institutional prerogatives. It's a shared commitment to the spirit of the law. I'll give you another example from the American setting. If you think about presidential term limits in the United States historically. Prior to 1951, as many of you I'm sure know, for 150 years, the US Constitution placed no limits on how many terms a president could be reelected. So legally, if reelected, a president could be president for life in the United States before 1951. Famously, of course, George Washington stepped down after 2 terms. And for nearly 150 years, no president ever even sought a 3rd term, including very ambitious presidents. But it was not the Constitution that prevented this from happening. It was an unwritten rule of self-restraint. So these 2 norms of mutual toleration and forbearance are what my co-author and I call the soft guardrails of our democracy. They help prevent normal, healthy political competition from spiraling into the kind of partisan fight to the death that wrecked democracy in Europe in the 1930s and Latin America in the 60s and 70s. America hasn't always had these soft guardrails. It wasn't born with them. It didn't have them, for instance, in the 1790s, when institutional warfare between the Federalists, including John Adams, and the Republicans nearly destroyed the Republic before it even got started. It didn't certainly have, the U.S. didn't have these soft guardrails in the run-up to the U.S. Civil War. Historian Joanne Freeman has counted in the 1850s, in the lead-up to the Civil War, she counts the number of acts of violence on the floor of Congress, and she discovers instances of fistfights, canings, stabbings. She counts 125 different acts of violence on the floor of the U.S. Congress. Obviously, norms of mutual toleration were not well developed at that moment. These norms remained low, of course, during the Civil War and after the Civil War. The late 1860s and early 1870s were replete with hardball politics. An impeachment of a president was launched in 1868. Supreme Court nominees were blocked. Supreme Court size was expanded in 1866 and 1869, and there was a fraudulent presidential election in 1876. But for very tragic reasons that we discuss in our book, beginning in the late 19th century, Democrats and Republicans began to accept one another as legitimate, and they largely avoided destabilizing acts of constitutional hardball. In particular, what prompted this was that Republicans gave up on the cause of Reconstruction in the U.S. South, in effect giving up on the cause of racial equality in the U.S. South. And giving up on the cause of racial equality, this was a kind of tragic truce that we still live with today in the United States. Republicans allowed Democrats to disenfranchise blacks in the South, and so Southern Democrats no longer viewed Republicans as an existential threat. Mutual toleration was restored. Forbearance reemerged. So again, a tragic irony of our history is that our norms of mutual toleration and forbearance, which are preconditions for democracy, were established at the price of racial exclusion and single-party rule in the U.S. South. So our democracy was fundamentally incomplete, but this also meant that beginning in the early 20th century, constitutional hardball diminished. There were no impeachments or successful court packings. Senators were judicious in their use of the filibuster and the right of advice and consent, and outside of wartime, presidents avoided acting unilaterally. So for more than a century, from the late 19th century to the late 20th century, our system of checks and balances worked. But again, they worked because they were reinforced by norms of mutual toleration and forbearance. So we show in our book that these norms have been unraveling since the 1990s, over the last quarter century. We argue this style of politics began really in the 1990s, and we don't attribute it to Newt Gingrich, but he's certainly one of the first actors who used these strategies that we see more frequently today. Newt Gingrich, who became Speaker of the House of Representatives in 1995, beginning in the early 1990s, instructed his very self-consciously distributing audio tapes to his members, Republican members of Congress, instructed his members of Congress when talking about Democrats in public to use terms like betray, anti-flag, traitor to describe Republicans. So in other words, he encouraged his Republican allies to abandon the norm of mutual toleration. Gingrich was also a master of constitutional hardball. He engineered the first major government shutdown of the modern era, and 3 years later, the Republican House carried out a mostly partisan impeachment of Bill Clinton. This was the first presidential impeachment, remember, in 130 years when this happened. Norm erosion really accelerated in the 2000s. Of course, there's elements of tit for tat here, but I think the evidence pretty firmly supports the contention that Republicans were really the first movers. During the Obama era, the Tea Party movement radicalized the Republicans, encouraging them to abandon mutual toleration. Republican leaders like Newt Gingrich, again, Sarah Palin, Rudy Giuliani, Mike Huckabee, told their followers that President Obama didn't love America, that Obama and the Democrats weren't real Americans. The so-called birther movement went a step further, asserting that President Obama wasn't born in the United States, thereby challenging his basic legitimacy to even be president. I'll just give you one example. Colorado Congressman Mike Kaufman declared at one point, "I do not know if Barack Obama was born in the United States of America, but I do know this, that in his heart, he's not an American. He's just not an American." Now, Americans have always had an extremist fringe, but this was no longer fringe politics. These were national Republican leaders. These were Republicans on live national television at the convention in 2016, chanting "lock her up" about the Democratic candidate for president. Leading Republicans now were, for the first time in more than a century, denying the legitimacy of their Democratic rivals. Now, all of this is alarming because what we've learned studying other democracies and other places and other times is that in the absence of mutual toleration, if you regard your rival as an enemy, politicians are tempted to abandon forbearance and engage in an escalating spiral of constitutional hardball. When we view our partisan rivals as enemies, when we view them as an existential threat, then of course we grow tempted to use any means necessary to stop them. And that, I think, is what is beginning to happen. When Republicans won control of the Congress in 2010, they adopted an overt and explicit strategy of obstructionism. There were actually more filibusters during President Obama's second term than in all of the years between World War I and the end of the Reagan presidency combined. President Obama responded with constitutional hardball of its own. When Congress refused to pass climate legislation and immigration reform, he circumvented it and made policy via executive order. This action was technically legal, but it clearly violated the spirit of the Constitution. And the most stunning act of constitutional hardball of all in the Obama years, I think at least, was the US Senate's 2016 decision not to allow President Obama to even hold hearings to fill the Supreme Court vacancy created by Justice Scalia's death. This move was unprecedented since 1866. Now, all of this was before Donald Trump was elected president. So the problem is not just that Americans elected a demagogue in 2016. It's that we elected a demagogue when the soft guardrails protecting our democracy are becoming unmoored. So why is all of this happening? Well, we argue in our book that what's shredding our norms, what's putting our democracy at risk, is polarization. Over the last 25 years, Democrats and Republicans have come to truly fear and loathe one another. In 1960, many of you maybe have heard about these survey results. In 1960, in a survey, 5% of Republicans and 4% of Democrats said they would be displeased if their child married somebody of the other political party. Today, that number is 50%. According to recent research by political scientist Liliana Mason, about 60% of Democrats and Republicans regard the other party as a danger to America. A recent Pew survey shows that 49% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats say the other party makes them afraid. We've not seen this kind of partisan hatred since the end of the 19th century. People don't fear and loathe each other over taxes and healthcare. Today's partisan differences run much deeper. They're about race, religion, and way of life. America's parties have changed dramatically over the last 50 years. Their names, of course, haven't changed, but they have fundamentally changed in the social coalitions behind them. In the 1960s, the Republicans and the Democrats were culturally and demographically, especially the leadership, quite alike. There were big policy differences, of course, but demographically, they were both parties were overwhelmingly white and Christian. Three big changes have occurred over the last half century. First, the civil rights movement and the achievement of full civil rights and voting rights for all Americans in the 1960s led to a massive, although gradual, migration of Southern Democrats to the Republican Party, while at the same time, African Americans, especially in the South, became overwhelmingly Democratic. Second, over the past 50 years, the U.S. experienced a massive wave of immigration. Most of these immigrants ended up in the Democratic Party. And third, by the time of Reagan, evangelical Christians who until the 1980s had been evenly split actually between the two parties, actually more Democrats than Republicans, by the 1980s they had flocked overwhelmingly, evangelicals had flocked overwhelmingly to the Republican Party. So what do these three big changes mean? What it means is that today Democrats and Republicans are racially and culturally incredibly distinct. The Democrats are mostly a kind of rainbow coalition of urban and educated secular whites and ethnic minorities. Nearly half the Democratic Party's voters today are non-white. The Republicans, by contrast, remain overwhelmingly a white and Christian party. This is important because white Christians aren't just any group. They were once the majority, and even more importantly, they used to sit unchallenged atop America's social, economic, cultural, and political hierarchies. They filled the presidency, the Supreme Court, the Congress, governor's mansions. They were the pillars of local communities. They were the CEOs, the newscasters, the movie stars, and the college professors. Those days are long gone. But crucially, they were the face of the Democratic and Republican parties. No longer. Losing a majority and losing one's dominant social status can be deeply threatening. Many Republicans, not all for sure, but many Republican voters feel that the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. This, I think, is ultimately what fuels both the radicalization of the Republican Party and the polarization of our politics. The problem is that extreme polarization can kill democracies. This is a major lesson from the failure of democracies in Europe in the 1930s in South America in the 1960s and 70s. When politics is so deeply polarized that each side views a victory by the other side as intolerable, as beyond the pale, democracy is in trouble. Because when an opposition victory becomes intolerable, you of course begin to justify using extraordinary means to stop it. Things like violence, election fraud, coups. This is what wrecked democracy in Spain in the 1930s, Brazil in the 60s, Chile in the 1970s. Of course, Americans haven't reached that point. But Americans have reached a point where, according to exit polls in 2016, 1 out of every 4 Trump voters, so 1 out of every 4 people who voted for Trump, believed he was unfit for office, yet they still preferred him to the Democratic candidate. We've reached a point where, according to Gallup polls over the last several years, Republicans have a more favorable view of Vladimir Putin than of Hillary Clinton. These are dangerous levels of polarization. Donald Trump is a symptom of that polarization, not just a cause of it. And I'm sad to say his departure won't put an end to it. So where does that leave us? I have 25 minutes. What do we do about this? Time for me to sit down. No, I think I'll just conclude by saying there's 2 lessons, and I hope we can talk more about these. 2 big lessons I would like to just re-emphasize from the story that I've just told. First, I think the way our political parties pick our presidential candidates is broken. I'm not sure what the cures are. I don't think we need to go back to the smoke-filled back rooms. But a system that can give us Donald Trump is a system worth revisiting. As the primary season unfolds in front of us in 2020, I fear sometimes, at my darkest moments, that we're sleepwalking to a similarly disastrous outcome. Second lesson, the driver of many of our institutional dysfunctions in the United States is the kind of polarization I've described to you this evening. And I think the chief culprit behind this polarization is the radicalization of the Republican Party. And so any effort to confront America's democratic ills, I think, have to think about these 2 big problems. These are complicated problems with no single solution, but we need to confront them head on to really begin to address the problems in a serious way. Thank you very much.
And so Daniel Ziblatt was joined by the Dutch political journalist Chris Keine for a conversation about how the American political system is particularly vulnerable to demagogues, and that it's only our norms that saved us. Norms that become meaningless when someone refuses to play by the rules.
Why is Donald Trump unfit for office?
What I would argue makes somebody unfit for office, I mean, there's many things that might make someone unfit for office, but in particular, what really motivated us to write this book was the sense that somebody doesn't even play by the democratic rules of the game, or it has little commitment to the rules of the game, or overt hostility towards the basic rules of the game. Because if you can't even agree on the ground rules, then you can't have a democratic competition. Mm-hmm. So the thing that motivated us to really write this book was we had read this book by Juan Linz, great Spanish political scientist who taught for many years at Yale and studied the breakdown of democracy in the interwar years and in Latin America. And he proposed what he called a litmus test to identify authoritarian behavior of politicians before they get elected to office. And he was a brilliant guy and an inspiration for us. His writing wasn't always so clear, and it was spread out over many pages, this litmus test, but we condensed it into our book, and we kind of come up with this checklist of characteristics. And this is, I think, what you were referring to in your introduction. So does a politician condone or accept violence? Does a politician attack civil liberties, such as the media? Does a politician accept the legitimacy of their political rivals, or do they call their rivals criminals, agents of foreign powers? And then the 4th criteria that Linz identifies is, do politicians accept the basic rules of the game, of a constitutional order, of a democratic constitutional order? And what Linz said is that if you ever come across a politician who's running for office, who wants to campaign for office, who meets any of these criteria, you should get nervous. And what was so striking, he wrote this in the 1970s, Donald Trump was not a concept for him, was that Donald Trump checked all of these boxes. Mm-hmm. And so I think any politician that checks those boxes you ought to be worried about. It's no guarantee that it's not a foolproof system. It's no guarantee that they'll be a danger to democracy once in office, but it's a pretty good warning system.
Yeah. You spoke about the selection process and how it failed to stop Donald Trump from being the nominee in 2016. So how come the Republican Party didn't seat it, and why? Because that's what you said. Weren't they able to stop him from being the nominee?
I think there was two things that happened. One is a very common mistake, and the second is a kind of structural problem. So the common mistake is that, and this is something that we see repeated throughout history, is that when there's a demagogue on the horizon, so one can think of Mussolini in the 1920s, one can think of Hitler in Germany in the late 20s, one can think of Chavez. When there's a demagogue on the horizon who has a mass popular appeal, mainstream politicians get nervous, and they often tend to be quite hubristic. They think, aha, here's somebody who's a potential threat, somebody we could potentially use, we can tap into their appeal, and often out of miscalculation or out of opportunism, they think we can tap into this person, we can form alliances. And I think American politicians weren't used to dealing with this. What's interesting, you see similar things in contemporary Europe as well. In France, with Le Pen, and Kurt Waldheim when he ran for president in Austria, a while ago. I mean, that what happens is that I think in Europe, many politicians make the same mistake, but there's more of a history of this mistake happening, so people are more aware of it. I think most Republicans didn't understand the full scale of the threat and didn't realize the degree to which when they say, oh, well, we can deal with them, we can manage them, to what degree they were just parroting the same things we saw politicians saying in the 1920s and 1930s. And so that's the first thing. It's a kind of very human mistake to kind of underestimate the threat and have opportunism to miscalculate. So that's one thing. The second big mistake, though, I think is a structural problem, which is that the way our candidates are selected, it's very easy for somebody to come in from the outside and just rise right to the top.
And there was a scattered field in 2016.
And it was a scattered field that didn't help. But so we actually tracked over time. I forget if we included this in the book, the number of outsiders, so people who had never held elected office, running for the primary since 1972, and that number has increased since 1972. I mean, going back to the 1980s, and you had guys like Pat Robertson and people who had never held elected office, but the number of people not holding elected office running in the primaries has increased over time. And so, the fact that in the Democratic primary today, you have Tom Steyer, who's never had elected office, Andrew Yang, who's never held elected office. These kinds of outsiders have always been there, but the system makes it hard to stop these kinds of figures.
Yeah, but then again, I mean, the Republican Party wasn't really accommodating Donald Trump during the primaries, which, of course, is a competitive period, so you wouldn't expect that. But even after the convention, there were moments that maybe the dime could have fallen to the other side. The grab the pussy tape moment. Yeah. I mean, there was an enormous amount of pressure then on the top of the Republican Party to stop the candidacy because they thought it was lost. So is there a deeper cause, maybe in the line of the fears that you just mentioned, the racial, religious, lifestyle fears in the Republican Party that stopped them from stopping Donald Trump then?
Yeah, so certainly, and it's not just about the selection of candidates, because we see this wave around the world of similar kinds of candidates arising no matter what the democracy is. And so what's driving this is partly these kind of demographic trends that I've emphasized. What's also driving this kind of populist wave around the world is also economic, growing economic dislocation driven by increased inequality and declining social mobility, stagnating wages. All of these factors make this terrible brew, which demagogues can take advantage of. I guess my point, though, in talking about Huey Long and these other figures, is that I think it's a mistake to somehow assume that we're in a new era where it's a totally different world and the old rules of politics don't apply. We've seen these kinds of demagogues before in the US and in other countries. And I think really what's changed is the way in which these guys are allowed into office or not. And so that's why I'm kind of emphasizing this change. And so, it sometimes, when we talk about the crisis of democracy, it reminds me a little bit of discussions about climate change. It's sort of like history is just moving in this one terrible direction. Things are getting worse. The tides of disaffection are rising. And when it comes to climate change, I agree, I believe that. But when it comes to democracy, I don't think that's right. I think it's much more kind of, where it's the better natural kind of world metaphor would be of earthquakes. We kind of live through periods of earthquakes. The question is, how well built are our institutions to cope with these shocks? And I would say the American party landscape and these kind of very weak parties where you can run on your own with your own money, you don't need the party to actually gain the nomination. This makes us vulnerable to these earthquakes.
Yeah, because that's another thing you state in your book, that whereas my first hunch would be democracy is in the hands of we the people, so it should be the electorate to stop demagogues because we vote for them. You say it's the parties that have to protect democracy, not the electorate. Why is that?
Yeah, again, and it's, I could be charged of being an elitist here or something, but I guess the voters, of course, matter. But I think voters, it's hard to, the tides of voter disaffection move quite slowly, in fact. When you aggregate up every single individual citizen in the country, there's periods of disaffection, there's periods of satisfaction. And I think really what's changed is the way we select our candidates. And it's a bit of a roll of the dice. I mean, you could say the U.S. changed the system in 1972. Why is it only in two? And actually in 1972, when this reform was carried out, there were a bunch of political scientists who thought this was a disastrous reform and warned of demagogues. There was a political scientist, Nelson Polsby at UC Berkeley, who said, this is paving the way for demagogues. It took him a long time for his prediction to come out true, but I think there was something to it. And so it essentially increased the probability that this would happen. This, combined with the financial crisis, increased disaffection of voters. I wouldn't deny that there's increased dissatisfaction of voters as an outgrowth in the United States of the financial crisis. But it just lowers the threshold and makes it easier for these kinds of figures to get in. I mean, so it's, again, sometimes when I've been living in Berlin for the year, when I make this argument, people say, well, this sounds like, very elitist, and primaries are about letting voters choose the candidates. Yeah. But no German political party, including the Green Party, would ever allow a system like this where you have Bernie Sanders, who's not even a member of the party, running as a nominee for the party, and the other two guys have never even held elected office in the party, Tom Steyer, Andrew Yang. No party in Europe would allow this. And so I think the American parties are incredibly open, which in some sense allows it's a double-edged sword. It allows outsiders. It allows somebody like Barack Obama to win the nomination over Hillary Clinton. That may be a good thing, but it has this other side to it.
Yeah. On the other hand, as you say, Donald Trump is not the cause of this. He may be the result of it in a way, but he's also riding a wave that we could have seen coming for a long time. And you mentioned polarization and mutual tolerance and institutional forbearance that were all undermined since, Newt Gingrich was Speaker of the House. In the book, I think you say since Newt Gingrich entered the political stage, which was by the end of the 70s, but I mean, it wasn't Newt Gingrich. He was riding a wave himself. You pointed at demographics now and white fear, in fact, which is a terrible irony, because that's the same fear as the other period after the Reconstruction in the end of the 19th century that you mentioned, when the Republicans gave up the black vote for making this truce with the Democrats. I mean, are we still on square one? Is it still white fear that is determining American politics?
Yeah, I mean, this period is often called the Second Reconstruction, and I think that's a useful phrase, because what that suggests is that, just as the first there's nothing permanent about our politics, that it's possible to undo democratic reforms, and so the period of the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, is kind of analogous in the 1960s, and analogous to a series of constitutional amendments in the 1860s, which enfranchised African Americans. What I would hope is that we've learned from that experience, and to reduce polarization, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, in effect, or carry out a process, reduce our commitment to democratic norms. I mean, I think the implication of our argument is not obviously to reduce polarization. We should stop addressing questions of racial equality. The challenge is how to remain committed to racial equality and full democracy, while at the same time maintaining the stability of the system. And that's a hard kind of comment to make, because it suggests that all these things that we like don't fit together so easily. But the reality, I think, is that most democracies don't undergo this kind of major demographic change and stay democracies. I mean, this is something that's historically unprecedented. It's a real experiment. And I think the U.S. is a country, I would hope the U.S. is a country that can achieve this experiment. And I think, the reason this is not back to square one is, we have to remember, the U.S. has never been more democratic. I have this book with this very dark cover, How Democracies Die, but we have to remember this country.
There's lighter covers
yes,
too.
Right.
I must say that.
Yeah, the United States. Our democracy is not so fundamentally flawed. In the sense that the political system that gave rise to Barack Obama, that allowed Barack Obama to be elected president twice, is a system worth defending.
Professor Ziblatt, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Harvard historian and the author of How Democracies Die, Daniel Ziblatt, in conversation with Chris Kina back in January of 2020. Did you know that you can go to our website, john-adams.nl/videos, where there is a link to the video of this extraordinary event, and I'll also put the YouTube link in the show notes. We also have a newsletter you can sign up for, and a veritable treasure trove of great American thinkers and speakers at john-adams.nl. And while you're there, why not become a member of the John Adams? Not only will you support what we do, you get a discount to future live events. In the meantime, you should go to wherever you get your podcasts and leave a review of this show. This will help get the word out, and then we can keep on sharing the very best of American thinkers in Europe with you, free of charge. Well, that's it for this week's show. Our theme is called La Prensa by the Parlandos. Our editor is Tracy Metz. From Amsterdam, this was Bright Minds, a podcast from the John Adams Institute. I'm Jonathan Gruber. Thank you for listening.